This is the Samsung Galaxy A53, a successor to one of the most popular mid-range phones out there, the A52. There are certain parts of the A53 where you'll go, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is a $450 phone. But there are other things where you'll say, okay, I can see how this isn't exactly a top-of-the-line flagship. So what's the catch with the A53? When it comes to design, Samsung pretty much did a copy and paste of the A52. This means we have the same polished plastic sides, a matte plastic back, and the quad camera module on the back. It looks surprisingly nice for this price point, although it doesn't feel quite as premium as the flagship S series, which uses metal and glass. In terms of size, this phone is right in between the S22 and the S22 Plus and Ultra phones. So not really too big, but definitely not a small phone either. It's a nice in-between size that should be able to appeal to a wide range of people. This is the blue color variant, but you can also choose from black, white, and peach. One notable difference from last year's model is the removal of the headphone jack. So you'll have to use a USB-C adapter if you want to use wired headphones on the A53. But thankfully, this phone still allows for expandable storage. You can store up to 1 terabyte through the micro SD card slot, which is combined within the SIM card tray. The speakers are pretty much the same as last year, with one on the bottom and one just along the top edge of the phone, and they sound pretty good with a nice amount of volume too. And the last thing to cover in terms of design is, of course, the IP67 dust and water resistance. So you have that peace of mind not having to worry about occasional water exposure. The display on the A53 is almost the same as the A52 with its 6.5-inch 1080p AMOLED panel. I'm a big fan of this display. It's pretty sharp, it has good peak brightness up to 800 nits for outdoor viewing, and the only thing I noticed was that it has a slight warm magenta hue to it, which really isn't noticeable unless you put it side by side to another display. One big upgrade this year, however, is that it now has a 120Hz refresh rate across all models. Last year, the 120Hz display was reserved only for the higher end 5G A52 model, but this year on the A53, it's included from the base model up. And of course, this makes using the phone feel super smooth. It almost gives you the impression that it's faster just because of the higher refresh rate. This is super impressive to see at this price point, especially when you compare it to something like the new iPhone SE, which starts at a similar price point, but it only has a sub 1080p 60Hz display. Now, I will say that I noticed it dropping down from 120Hz here and there, more so than I did on my S22, which can be a bit of a distraction at times. I'm pretty sure this is performance related. I especially notice it when I first boot up the phone. It feels like it takes a minute or two to get settled into that 120Hz refresh rate. And that's something we'll continue to see throughout this review. It doesn't matter how great the hardware is if the performance isn't there to back it up. For unlocking the phone, we have both an in-display fingerprint scanner and face unlock. Both of these work really well, they're super fast, and I love having both of these options to choose from so I can pick which one is best depending on the situation. Now, when it comes to the camera system, the A53 is pretty much identical spec-wise to the A52, but there are some big improvements that I'll get into in just a minute. You have the same 4-camera module that consists of a wide lens, an ultra-wide, a macro, and a depth sensor, which helps with portrait photos. And honestly, the majority of the photos I took on the A53 turned out excellent. It has a really great camera system. Colors and dynamic range are on par with premium phones, and it's pretty sharp with its 16 megapixel resolution. And portrait photos are so good. Samsung is always on top of their game when it comes to portrait photos, but just look how clean these outlines are. I would never guess that these photos were taken on a sub $500 phone. Now, most of the improvements we see in the A53 cameras compared to the A52 is in the image processing. So for example, when it comes to zoom, there is no telephoto zoom lens on the A53, but zoomed photos still turn out fairly sharp because of Samsung's AI processing, similar to how Samsung does the 100x zoom on their S22 Ultra. The processing on the full res 64 megapixel photos is much better as well. That mode used to sacrifice colors and dynamic range, but now they're almost identical to the 16 megapixel photos, just sharper, which is great. I also noticed an improvement on macro photos. They're so much sharper than they were last year, and most of that is just processing. Low light photos are excellent as well. It normally takes a few seconds of an exposure, but the photos have very clean processing, and are brightened really nicely. And considering the new iPhone SE doesn't even have a night mode, Samsung is crushing the competition here. 4K video on the A53 is pretty good. It looks sharp with good autofocus, and I notice a lot of improvements in dynamic range, especially on the front-facing camera, which is something the A52 struggled with last year. Now, last year's model didn't have great dynamic range, but it's looking like this year's model handles that a lot better. The sky is properly exposed, and yeah, everything looks pretty good. But unfortunately, the stabilization is still pretty wonky, even though the main lens supposedly has OIS built in. This is something I noticed with the previous model. I was hoping they would fix it here, but no, it still has that wobbly jello look to it. There is a super steady mode you can enable, but it's only in 1080p and it just destroys the video quality. It's pretty much unusable. But for more static shots, the footage is great. It also shoots slow motion in 240 FPS at 720p resolution, which looks surprisingly good. So let's talk performance. Now, the A53 has the octa-core Exynos 1280 processor with 6GB of RAM on the 128GB model and 8GB of RAM on the 256GB model. So the Exynos processor is supposed to be more powerful and more efficient than the Snapdragon 750G chip, which we saw on the A52, but performance hasn't really blown me away. I already mentioned that I noticed drop frames here and there in the 120Hz refresh rate, but I also noticed things like apps taking a couple of seconds to open up and some slowdown during multitasking. And this is one of the trade-offs you get with the A53. It just can't compete in terms of performance with the higher end smartphones. And since I've kind of been hating on the iPhone SE throughout this video, I've got to give credit where credit is due and say that the iPhone SE has much better performance than the A53. Asphalt 9 is my go-to game I use to benchmark gaming performance, and the SE is sharper and has better frame rate than the A53. Now, I don't think performance is going to be a deal breaker for most people because it is still fine for the majority of everyday tasks. I don't have any issues consuming media, responding to emails, and internet browsing. But if you're looking for top-of-the-line performance, this might not be the phone for you. Thankfully, battery life has been pretty solid. It's been bumped up to 5,000 milliamp hours from 4,500 milliamp hours last year, so that's about a 10% boost in battery capacity. And if you combine that with the more efficient Exynos chip, you get pretty good results. I was worried the 120Hz display might drain the battery pretty quickly, but I've still been able to get a full day of use with about 5 hours of screen on time. And if you want better battery life, you can always just disable the 120Hz display in settings. As for recharging, the A53 supports up to 25 watts fast charging, but still no wireless charging, which would have been nice to see here. So for $450, you are getting a lot with the A53. You get a camera system on par with that of higher end flagship phones, a beautiful 120Hz display, and great battery life. As long as you expect to not be blown away by performance, the A53 is an incredible phone for its price. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.